Isaiah chapter number 58. This book, while it is not necessarily it's not necessarily made up of the most encouraging fibers of information here. It is attacking a couple different things in Jewish culture at that time, which, man, we could very easily apply to not just to Jewish culture, but also to religious culture, period. And we could even take this and apply it within our own Baptist churches and potentially even our own church. And so there's a couple things in here in this chapter, while it's not a long chapter, that really need to be pointed out. Here in Isaiah 58, God is going to expose the emptiness of two religious rituals that were practiced during Isaiah's day. He's going to talk about fasting, and he's going to talk about Sabbath keeping. And the idea here is that the Jews were doing things, but they were not actually sincerely doing anything. Both of these things are expressions of, well, I'm not doing this, so that must make me good. That must make me acceptable to God. It must make me right with God because I'm not doing those things. In fasting, you don't eat. That's all. I'm not eating, so that must make me right with God. In Sabbath keeping, you don't work. So, I'm not doing any work on the Sabbath day, so therefore, I must be right with God. However, there is an important aspect to this chapter that shows us that what we don't do isn't enough to make us right with God. Our walk with God shouldn't just be defined by the things that we don't do, but by the things which we do for the Lord. And I think that's very appropriate for us to speak about as conservative, independent Baptist Christians, because it's very easy for us to get hung up on our standards and the things that we don't do. Well, I don't go to this, and I don't do that, and I don't wear this, and I don't say that, and I don't listen to this, and I don't watch that. And so long as I've got all of the don'ts right, then that must mean that I am right before God. But that's not necessarily the truth. That's actually a very Pharisaical way of looking at it. Now, I'm not against standards or convictions at all, and we ought to have those things not so that it makes us look good or makes us conform to the Baptist image. We ought to have standards and convictions for the purpose of protecting ourselves from the devil's attacks that he desires, or even to protect ourselves from our own flesh that is trying to bring us down, that is trying to destroy our testimony. And so he's going to speak directly here in chapter 58 to the Jews, and we're going to listen in. But we're also going to be able to take information from this and make application as well. Look at Isaiah 58, verse number 1, and we'll read the first 3 verses. Cry aloud, spare not. By the way, God is speaking to Isaiah here. Cry aloud, spare not. Lift up thy voice like a trumpet and show my people their transgression and the house of Jacob their sins. Yet they seek me daily and delight to know my ways as a nation that did righteousness and forsook not the ordinance of their God. They ask of me the ordinances of justice. They take delight in approaching to God. Wherefore have we fasted, say they, and thou seest not? Wherefore have we afflicted our soul, and thou takest no knowledge? Behold, in the day of your fast you find pleasure, and exact all your labors. Let's go back. At the beginning of verse number 3, he says, cry aloud to Isaiah. He tells Isaiah to lift up your voice. Don't hold anything back. Lift up your voice like the sound of a trumpet. Now, you remember we had evangelist Barry Webb. He stood over here. He had a trumpet. He had a bass trumpet. He had I don't remember what else he was playing. Other instruments. One characteristic of a brass instrument is that it's very loud, right? My violin, you can't really hear it probably when I'm playing during the congregationals, and that's kind of okay with me because, I don't want to be the center of the show. I just kind of want to help out in adding to the praise whenever I have the opportunity to. But a trumpet or a brass instrument, man, those things are loud, which is why they use them in a war setting. They use that trumpet or the bugle because it is a pitch which is easily heard in the midst of chaos and loud noises. And so they use the bugle because it is piercing. It is attention grabbing. It is easy for the listener to listen to without being distracted. And so he says to the preacher, lift up your voice like a trumpet. And then, preacher, what are you supposed to do with your voice when you lift it up? You are supposed to show my people their transgression. Oh, no, we don't like that, do we? We don't want the preacher to get up there and to get a little hot under the collar and start pointing out things in our lives that are not right. We don't want the preacher to start meddling in our homes and meddling in our hobbies and meddling in our TV shows and music. Now, the preacher may not point at you and he may not say your name and he may not even know any of those things. Sometimes people will joke with me, preacher, I got to stop telling you things because you keep preaching about me. And they're like, I know you're not actually. And sometimes it's like, no, wait a minute. I planned this sermon like 2 weeks ago, so you can't blame it on me. That was the Holy Spirit working right there. That wasn't me. We don't like to have our lives meddled with by someone else. And in this specific instance, God says to the preacher, lift up your voice, and I want you to point your finger at my people Israel and show them, reveal to them, shine a bright spotlight so that none can miss it upon their transgressions, it says, and the house of Jacob their sins. And then in the next verse, he is going to begin to speak almost sarcastically in Israel's place. It is like Israel is saying these words. Look what Israel says. Yet they seek me daily and delight to know my ways, as a nation that did righteousness and forsook not the ordinance of their God. And God is saying of Israel, well, Israel, they do seek after me daily. Okay, you got to think about the contrast between what was just said. Isaiah, go out and preach to them hard. Don't hold anything back. You shine a spotlight on their sin. Those people that seek me daily, the ones that delight to know my ways. As a nation, they did righteousness and forsook not the ordinance of God. And listen to what they ask me. They take delight in approaching to God, and they ask, wherefore have we fasted, say they, and thou seest not? Israel says, but God, we fasted, and why didn't you notice it? Wherefore have we afflicted our soul, and thou takest no knowledge? God, why didn't you seem to notice when I was afflicting my soul, when I was fasting? Why didn't you seem to care? God answers, behold, in the day of your fast, you find pleasure and exact all your labors. And we'll come to that here in just a little bit. But he says, yet they seek me daily and delight to know my ways. What God is doing here in these next verses, he is describing the appearance of their spiritual life. He says, I want you to go and point out their sin. Now, what they appear like they're doing all the right things. They have been successful in keeping up appearances. It says they seek me daily, so they show up to the synagogues. They show up to the temple when necessary. They are offering their sacrifices when they are supposed to. They are paying me lip service, but their heart is far from me. That's what he's talking about. And then he says, they even go so far as to fast. Of course, we know what fasting is. Typically, fasting has to do with withholding food from ourselves for a period of time for a specific reason. Now, you can do intermittent fasting for health purposes. What it's talking about here isn't that. It is withholding, typically food from yourself for the purpose of getting God's attention. In other words, I am denying myself, and during that time where I am denying sustenance and that which my body craves, I am going to spend that time instead praying and pouring my heart out to the Lord because it's costing me something. It's going to mean more to me. But Israel was doing that, but not for the right reasons, is what God is pointing out here. Wherefore have we fasted, and thou seest not? It was a spiritual veneer. It was a fine-looking wood, but it was only 1 millimeter thick. And everything else was particle board underneath. They felt God was unfair to them. God, we fasted, but you don't answer my prayers. Don't you know that we seek you daily? Don't you know that we delight to know your ways? We've memorized scriptures. We've made our children memorize scriptures. We do righteousness. We take delight in approaching you. But God, why aren't you answering our prayers? Is the question being asked here. And so God answers. He says, behold, in the day of your fast you find pleasure, and exact all your labors. Behold, ye fast for strife and debate, and to smite with a fist of wickedness. Ye shall not fast as ye do this day, to make your voice to be heard on high. Is it such a fast that I have chosen? A day for a man to afflict his soul? Is it to bow down his head as a bulrush, and to spread sackcloth and ashes under him? Wilt thou call this a fast and an acceptable day to the Lord? He's asking them a bunch of questions, and he says, behold, in the day of your fast ye find pleasures, and exact all your labors. God says, okay, enough with this veneer, enough with this front that you're putting up of religiosity. Let's look at the reality. And the reality is, you weren't fasting with the right heart. You were doing it as an empty ritual. And I know I say this a lot, but when we come to church, are we doing it for the right reasons? And when we open our Bibles to read it, are we doing it for the right reasons? Or has it just become an empty ritual, something that we do out of rote habit? The reality was that even on the days when they were fasting and they were supposedly trying to seek the heart of God, they were still exploiting their own employees. God wasn't going to accept any fasting when it was connected with a heart of disobedience like this. On one hand, they said, oh, poor me, I'm fasting and I'm withholding from myself so that I can get the heart of God. And on the other hand, they were living in wickedness and disobedience. Listen to this. It was written in 1823 by Adam Clarke. He said, how can any nation pretend to fast or worship God at all, or dare to profess that they believe in the existence of such a being while they carry on the slave trade and traffic in the souls, blood, and bodies of men? Think about that question. Israel here was being blamed of something similar. You fast and you want to appear religious, but on the other hand, you are using and abusing your fellow man. Your heart is in disobedience. He goes on to say, behold, ye fast for strife and debate, and to smite with a fist of wickedness. Another aspect to this is why they were fasting. Were they simply fasting because they were trying to get a hold of the heart of God? What was it that they were fasting for? There's a big difference between me fasting for the will of God concerning a decision to be made and me fasting so that I can have a Porsche sitting in my garage. There's a big difference between the two of those things. One is for the direction of God and His will in my life, and the other is for something to consume upon my lusts. They fasted for, according to these verses, they were fasting for selfish needs like, Lord, will you help me win this argument? Or will you help me defeat this person? Their prayer came with fasting, but it was still a selfish and a wicked prayer. So God didn't answer. They threw up their hands. God, I'm fasting. Why aren't you answering? Well, because you're asking for selfish reasons. You're asking for even wicked reasons. He says, ye shall not fast as ye do this day to make your voice to be heard on high. There is a method of contacting me, God says. There is a method by which you can go through to get a hold of me and to get a hold of my heart, but this is not it. You are going through the motions. It's like pulling out one of my old cell phones. I still have my iPhone 4 in my drawer, and I remember being so proud of that when I got that phone. It was before I was married, and it was my first iPhone, and I thought it was awesome. I had all the coolest apps, that everybody was messing with, and I was so proud of myself for that iPhone 4. It was amazing. I pull it out now, and it's like this big, so it feels so small and blocky compared to, phones today. But if I were to take that phone and charge it up and go and try to use it today, it's not going to accomplish a whole lot for me right now. Although if I can connect it to the internet, it'll do a few things. But even many of the apps are outdated and I can't update them. That phone, if I go in and I dial my phone number, well, I guess let's dial my wife's phone number. Well, I really want to talk to my wife and I'm just missing her and I just need to hear her voice. And so I dial in 770-883. I'm not going to say the rest so that weirdos don't go call her, But and I dial it and I put it up to my ear and I'm going to hear doo-doo-doo, we're sorry, but this phone is not connected to a network. What? But it's a phone. I typed in, I have the exact phone number right here. It's saved right there. This is the phone number to get a hold of my wife. What am I missing? I'm missing the power. I'm missing the connection. And so I can go through the means of getting down on my knees or falling, prostrate on the ground and calling out to God. I can even go through a whole day of fasting, but not doing it with the right heart, not doing it sincerely, doing it ritualistically or religiously. I can even be doing it for the wrong reasons. And then I throw my hands up and I say, but I dialed the right number, God. What's wrong? What's wrong is where your heart is. You're missing the power and the connection that comes with being right before the Lord. He says, "Ye shall not fast as ye do this day to make your voice to be heard on high." The purpose of their fasting was to glorify themselves, to make their voice heard on high. He says, this isn't how you're to do it. You will not fast as you do this day. He says, is it such a fast that I have chosen? Now, in other words, is this the kind of fasting that I have asked you to do? No, this is the kind of fasting that God rebukes. This is the kind of fasting that God says is hollow, empty. It's just for show. There's no spiritual substance behind it. It's like when we're told in the New Testament, when you fast, anoint yourself. In other words, comb your hair, wash your face. Why did they have to say that? Well, if any of you have ever tried fasting for any particular reason, come around about 9 o'clock, if you skipped breakfast and your body's used to having breakfast, your stomach starts to feel sour and then it starts to show on your face a little bit. Oh, I'm so hungry. And then, come about lunchtime, if you've made it that long without whining or complaining, you're like, oh, I'm so hungry and now I'm weak because I haven't had any food. And then somebody comes along and you're like, what's wrong? What's wrong? Like, oh, I'm fasting. I'm fasting for the Lord. And oh, it's so awful. I'm hungry and my stomach's growling. And okay, what's going on? Or you mess your hair all up and you look disheveled. And why? Because I'm just going through a trial right now. I'm fasting. Okay, I'm exaggerating. I'm being dramatic. But that's what they're talking about. You're doing it for show. You're doing it so others can see, hey, I'm fasting. Really, if you're fasting, no one else needs to know except maybe your wife, so she knows not to cook you dinner. Or your husband, so that he knows he's getting a double portion tonight because you're not eating your portion. But nobody else really needs to know because it's not between you and them. I don't need to announce it to the church. We don't need to have a sign-up sheet, of fasting for the week. That's between you and the Lord. It helps to keep us humble, and when you're fasting, you comb your hair, you wash your face, you put a smile on your face. And even if your stomach says, I'm so hungry, and if your body says, I'm so weak because I haven't eaten today and I'm not used to this, and you keep right on trucking, and you, in a sense, you be happy because you're not fasting for their benefit or you're for your benefit. You're trying to get a hold of the Lord. Now, this is not the kind of fasting that God has chosen. Even though they were doing all the right things, he says he talks here about bowing down his head like the bulrush, spreading sackcloth and ashes. They're fasting. It's, I'm fasting. So they're bowing down their head. And just to make sure everybody knows I'm fasting, I'm going to throw ash out here and put some sackcloth and I'm going to sit, crisscross applesauce down on my ashes, and so everybody can see I'm fasting and poor me, or that everybody would think well of me. The people of Isaiah's day had the same problem as the Pharisee did in Jesus' day. They trusted in their empty rituals apart from spiritual reality. See, what is real fasting? Fasting is real if it is partnered with real repentance, and it isn't only about image. It has great power before God. Remember in Matthew 17, the disciples are trying to cast out a demon out of this person, and they were unable to. And Jesus says in Matthew 17:21, howbeit this kind goeth not out, but by prayer and fasting. Those two things coupled together with a heart of repentance, well, I can tell you what, God can inject great power into that. Now, we may not be able to see through the hypocrisy of others, but God certainly sees through the hypocrisy of empty religious rituals, just like fasting. Remember in Luke 18, I've talked about this story recently. You have the Pharisee standing in the temple, and then you have the publican down kneeling in the temple. And the Pharisee stands, and the Bible says, prays thus with himself. I liked that phrase. He prays thus with himself. I heard today, and I want to use this phrase. I haven't decided how I'm going to use it yet, but heard today somebody say, well, you know what? I'm sending you good thoughts. I'm sending you positive thoughts, for this problem that you're having. And the person replied with good thoughts. Good thoughts aren't going to go any further than your brain. What good are good thoughts? That's not helpful to me. You need to pray for me. And then I thought to myself, well, you know what? Some people's prayers don't go any further than their brains either, because they're not right with God. There is sin between them and God, and their prayers aren't going anywhere. There is sin between them and God because, one, they're unsaved. The only prayer that an unsaved person can pray that God is going to hear is one of repentance and seeking salvation. But then there's Christians that are not right before God. And he's waiting for that prayer of repentance and seeking of forgiveness from that Christian. But the Pharisee stood there and prayed thus with himself. That's because his prayers weren't going any further than in the ceiling or his own brain, depending on how loud he was, saying his words, I guess. But he said, I thank God that I am, not as this guy is. And he gives a list of how great he is. And he says, I fast twice a week. He makes a point out of saying that. He's a self-righteous person. Oh, we talk about those Pharisees being so self-righteous, but it isn't just them. We ourselves can become very self-righteous. Well, I go to church. Well, not only do I go to church, I go to church every service. Well, not only do I go to every service, I go to a Baptist church. I dress up. I, fill in the blank. Excuse me. And we begin to think so very highly of ourselves. When God doesn't want the prayer of the Pharisee, he desires the prayer of the publican who couldn't even lift up his own head out of humility before God. Now, it isn't that Isaiah or God are against fasting here. They are not against fasting. They're against any empty religious ritual. The answer isn't to stop fasting. They're not trying to tell Israel, well, then stop fasting if it doesn't work. Oh, no. It can work. But to get right with God, your fasting has to be more than just superficial. Hey, by the way, we could take that statement and apply it to a whole lot of things in our Christian life. If you want to be right with God, then you need to read your Bible in more than just a superficial way. We know what superficial means. It is just skimming. It is just surface. It is shallow. There is no depth to it. We are doing it out of ritual, but not for reason. So we need to read our Bibles in more than just a superficial way. Hey, you know what? If you want to be right before God, if you want to see answers to your prayer, then you need to pray in more than just a superficial way. What is praying superficially? Well, it is praying without much thought, to be honest. It is oftentimes, it reveals itself in great repetition, saying the exact same things all the time. And that's very easy to do. I know that. I catch myself doing the same thing all the time, saying the exact same phrases in the exact same order in my prayers. What does that reveal? I mean, imagine if I were to talk to you that way. Sometimes that does happen. We have the same conversations all the time. But imagine if I were to talk to everybody around me in the same way that we may talk to God. and we say the exact same thing in the exact same order every single time. Or we only come to God with our hands out saying, can I have, can I have, can I have, can I have? Imagine if that's all I did with you. I come to you and everything I ever said to you was, can I have, can I have, can I have, can I have? What do you have to offer me? I don't think you'd appreciate talking to me very much. You'd see me coming and you'd think, oh, brother, here comes the preacher again with his hand out, Or here comes the preacher again. I can already tell you what he's going to say because he says the exact same thing every single time. But if that's what our prayer life is like, well, it's superficial. And it's no wonder we're not getting a hold of the heart of God. It's no wonder that it doesn't mean anything deep. No wonder we're not actually having a relationship with God. For me to have a relationship with my wife, we have to say more than just the same old stuff every single day. For me to build a relationship with you, it's got to be more than, hey, how you doing, brother? How's the weather? On the way into church, and have a good week on the way out of church. And that's all we ever say to one another. We're never going to grow in our relationship toward each other if we don't get beyond that. No, they're not saying to stop fasting. They're saying that it needs to be more than superficial. As Jesus said to his people about empty religious rituals of the Pharisees in Matthew 23:23, Jesus said this, "Woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you paid tithe of mint and anise and cumin, and have omitted the weightier matters of the law, judgment, mercy, and faith. These ought ye to have done, and not to leave the other undone." He says, you do all the outward things. You tithe of fine things so that everybody can applaud you and pat you on the back. But the more weightier, the more important spiritual things that ought to be ingrained in who you are simply aren't there. Those are the things you need to focus on. Look at verse number 6. He says, is not this the fast that I have chosen? And he's going to reveal what the fast is. Is not this what I've told you to do? To loose the bands of wickedness, to undo the heavy burdens, and to let the oppressed go free, and that you break every yoke? Is it not to deal thy bread to the hungry, and that thou bring the poor that are cast out to thy house? When thou seest the naked, that thou cover him, and that thou hide not thyself from thine own flesh? He asks the question, is not this the fast that I have chosen, to loose the bands of wickedness? If you want to fast the right way, in a way that is pleasing to me, then you begin first by getting right with your brothers and sisters and stop oppressing one another. Stop injuring one another. Stop stabbing one another in the back. Stop being bitter against one another. Stop tattling and tearing down one another. He says, loose the bonds of wickedness. Undo the heavy burdens. Let the oppressed go free. Break every yoke here. First, they had to stop acting wickedly towards others. This means that getting right with God starts here with doing right towards the others around us. And he says also, deal thy bread to the hungry. Cover. He says, hide not thyself from thine own flesh. Then they had to start acting lovingly. So you stop behaving wickedly towards one another. You stop backbiting. You stop telling stories about one another. You stop this whole process of, somebody did something wrong against me, and so I'm going to go over here and I'm going to tell this person about that wrong thing they did against me because, man, I'm just upset about it and I want them to be upset about it too. And it spreads. And in a sense, you are doing exactly the anti-biblical method of righting a wrong. Doesn't work that way. You know what? If somebody wrongs you, whether they realize it or not, do you know the first place you need to go? Now you might say, well, to that person. Even before then. Even before you go to them, the person who wronged you, to discuss the situation, the first place you go is to the Lord. Why do I say that? Well, if you just go straight to the person who has wronged you, there's a chance, a pretty good chance, that you're going to respond to them in the wrong way. in anger or frustration or something like that and say something you probably ought not to have said. So first, you take it to the Lord. You know, all those things you would have said to this person, I can't believe they blah, 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 blah. Take that to God. Say it to God. You know what? He's really good at keeping secrets. And you say, God, I just don't understand this. I can't believe this. I know I can't judge their motives, but it certainly seems like they meant to hurt me. And I know they don't understand how much this hurt. And you just take it to the Lord. And then once you've just laid it out to him, you know, some people suggest writing letters when you get angry about something. Write that person a letter. You just fill it full of all of that vitriol, you know, that you're just full of, that angry fire. And then you take it and burn it. Don't mail it. You take it and you burn that letter. Well, I have an even better way than that. You get on your knees and you tell it all to God. You just let it all out there. You make sure you get it, wring out every single drip of that ire before God. And then breathe. And then begin to pray for that person. And begin to have a forgiving spirit toward that person. So not only in this passage is he saying that we ought to stop doing wickedly towards others, but then to go even beyond that and start doing right towards others, acting lovingly towards others, doing loving things for them here. He's talking about, man, I'll be glad when this cough is gone, giving bread to the hungry, covering those who are naked, hide not thyself from thine own flesh. You know, being willing to give of yourself, give of your time, give of your talents, give of your wallet and your bank account to be able to help the people around you that God has placed in your path who need you. And of course, during this time period, we also have slavery going on, which is going on all across the world since the beginning of mankind and still even happens today in many cultures around the world. But he is telling them this is how you ought to behave toward your fellow man. He says, you want to be pleasing to me? This is where you start. Then look what he says is going to happen. And this is the encouraging part of the chapter. After that, then shall thy light break forth as the morning, and thy health shall spring forth speedily, and thy righteousness shall go before thee. The glory of the Lord shall be thy rear reward. Then shalt thou call, and the Lord shall answer. Before, Israel was saying, God, I'm going to great religious lengths to get your attention, but you're not answering me. Why not? God says, get your heart right before me first. Then, he says, then thou shalt cry, and he shall say, here I am. If thou take away from the midst of thee the yoke, and put forth of the finger, and speaking of vanity, and if thou draw out thy soul to the hungry, and satisfy the afflicted soul, then shall thy light rise in obscurity, and thy darkness be as the noonday. And the Lord shall guide thee continually, and satisfy thy soul in drought, and make fat thy bones, and thou shalt be like a watered garden, and like a spring of water, whose waters fail not. And they that shall be of thee shall build the old waste places. Thou shalt raise up the foundations of many generations, and thou shalt be called the repairer of the breach, the restorer of paths to dwell in. And we'll stop there. He says, then shall thy light break forth as morning. If God's people, not just Israel in Isaiah's time, who were facing impending judgment by not just the Assyrians, but the Babylonians, if they would heed to this, yes. But also this applies to you and I. If God's people would couple their fasting with lives of righteousness and love, they would see answered prayer. They would have lives that are full of light, that are full of healing, that are full of righteousness, and that are full of the glory of the Lord. Notice he talks about the glory of the Lord being your rear reward. This is like that rear guard that hangs back and stays behind us to protect us from the things that we can't see coming up and attacking us from behind. We have the glory of the Lord backing us up, standing behind us. When others try to attack, we can stand there, not me, not in my own power, but look who's backing me up. God is. That is, if I'm walking and living with a heart of righteousness right before the Lord. He says, if thou take away from the midst of thee the yoke. We know what a yoke is, not the yolk in the egg, but the yoke that combines two oxen together to be able to pull a load. Now, there are certain things that we are to be yoked to. We are not to be yoked together with unbelievers. We know that much. We are not to be yoked together with the devil. We are not to be yoked together in sin. There are things that are not supposed to be yoked to our necks so that we are pulling and advancing those things. But God says, I will give you a yoke, but my yoke is easy and my burden is light. He is to be the yoke. His will, His work is to be the yoke. The yoke they're talking about here is trying to bear this religious fruitfulness, but also living like the world all at the same time. A burden, which we saw back in chapter number 57, was too great for them to bear. The greatness of thy burden hath wearied thee. It said, if not those exact words, something very similar to that. And so he says, the putting forth of the finger and speaking vanity. The putting forth of the finger, okay, this is the pointing and talking about somebody, the bitter spirit, the speaking of vanity. You put those things away. He gives them three things here to stop doing. One, they need to stop oppressing others, treating them like animals. They need to stop, pointing the fingers at other people and saying they're the ones to blame, or pointing the finger and saying, well, at least I'm not as bad as they are. And they must stop speaking wickedness. Those are sins that they are committing, sins against others and sins against God. He says, and if thou draw out thy soul to the hungry. In other words here, it's an odd way of saying it, but opening your heart to the people who are hurting and needy. It's very easy to keep a closed heart as a Christian. When people come and they need help or are asking for prayer and stuff, it's very easy to just keep your heart closed. I don't want to get affected by your problems in your life. I don't want to get sucked into it. I don't want to have to deal with it. And that's why you see videos like in New York City where somebody will get mugged and beaten and stabbed and they'll be laying there on the roadside. And it's not like there was nobody to help them. There was plenty of people there to help them, but nobody did. Everybody saw what was going on and they just kept walking by. And then, even after the mugger left, that person is lying there on that ground, maybe moving, maybe not even moving. They're hurt. They're very injured. People just keep right on walking. They see them, but they just keep walking by. And why would they just keep walking by? Well, they're busy. They got places to go. They got things to do. I don't want to get involved in this problem. That guy's probably going to make it. Let somebody else take care of it. Somebody else will see it. Somebody else will call 911 or flag down a police officer or something. Somebody will take care of it. Not me. I'm late for an appointment, or I've got to go get this done. I've got to go do that. I got a nail appointment or a hair appointment, or I'm supposed to meet my buddies to do this or that. And I don't have time to open up my heart to this person's needs and get involved because it might cost me more than I want to pay right now. Or it might cost me more emotional capital, than I'm willing to pay right now. And here he's instructing them to do the opposite. He says, and if thou draw out thy soul to the hungry and satisfy, I like that term here, to satisfy the afflicted soul. I don't know how to fix every problem that is out there. And people can come and sit in my office and say, Pastor, this is what's going on in my life. Can you help me? The answer may very well be, I don't know. I don't know how to answer that. I don't know the appropriate scriptures or the appropriate steps, to help you with that particular problem, but that should not stop us from being used in a situation like that. Sometimes we think if I don't have the answers, then I don't even want to step into the ring. I don't even want to, allow myself to open up my heart to somebody's problems because I may not know how to fix it. Well, it's not my job to fix those problems. Sometimes all I can do really is just listen. And I may not have anything of wisdom to say, to be honest. Just listen and then pray with them. And make sure that we get a hold of God's heart. On one hand, we have sins of commission. He's telling them, stop abusing and using people, stop pointing the finger, stop speaking wickedness. On the other hand, he's saying, here's some good things you need to start doing. Those would be sins of omission, things that we're supposed to be doing, but we're not doing. Do you see what's going on in this chapter? I led the chapter with this thought that there were going to be two things we see in here. There are the two religious rituals that Israel was practicing, fasting and Sabbath keeping here, that were, these are things I don't do, so that must make me right with God. And God is saying, no, it's not just the things you don't do. Yes, absolutely, there are certainly things we don't do. There are certainly things that we don't involve ourselves in. But it isn't just that. It isn't just thou shalt nots, but it is also thou shalts. Here are things that you ought to be doing as a Christian, that you ought to be involving yourself in, such as witnessing and being a testimony for Christ, such as loving people and helping and praying and edifying them in the best way that you know how. Those are things you ought to be doing for the Lord. And to not do those things is a sin of omission. We continue on, and I'm nearing the end of the chapter here. He says, then shall thy light rise in obscurity. I just dragged it the wrong direction and lost my notes here. Gotta find them again. Then shall thy light rise in obscurity, and thy darkness be as the noonday. To the repentant heart, God promises blessing. Not only are they going to have light, but even their darkness shall be as noonday. Think about what that means. You and I are still going to go through relatively dark times. We're not exempt from heart attacks, right? Just because we're a Christian, and even just because we might be right before God, doesn't exempt us from a heart attack. It doesn't exempt us from having our cars not pass, inspection. It doesn't exempt us from tough times. But even those dark times can still be bright as noonday. You see, God never tells us that we're not going to struggle. He never tells us that we're not going to walk through valleys. He never tells us that there's not going to be physical pain, or that there's not going to be heartache, or that there's not going to be financial woes. He never promises those things to us, even though many preachers want to say that He has given us those promises, and you just have to try harder to claim them. No, but what He has said is this: when you go through those things, I will be with you. When you pass through the fire, you will not be consumed. When you pass over the floods, they will not sweep o'er you. He says, even thy darkness, it'll be like noonday. The lost world, they can't say that. When they lose a loved one, it could not be any darker for them. When they are struggling with addiction, or when they are struggling with mental problems, it could not be any darker for them, any more hopeless. But to the Christian, there is always hope. And I like that phrase, thy darkness be as the noonday. The Lord shall guide thee continually. This is a promise for those who are doing more than just empty spiritual rituals or religious rituals. If you want the guidance of the Lord, then religious ritual isn't enough. If you want God to guide you this year in 2024 in your marriage or in your family or in this church, it's got to be more than just showing up. Hey, that's a good start. Showing up to church is a good start, but you need more than religious ritual. You need to be right before God. We need to seek God with a sincere heart and with sincere actions. He says He'll satisfy thy soul in drought and make fat thy bones. I'm sorry, ladies, about that one, but He says, I'll satisfy your souls in drought and I will make fat your bones. And of course, fatness in Scripture is always a sign of health. It is always a sign of abundance. We as Americans understand a little bit about abundance, right? A little bit about having a whole lot more than we need. And He says, they that shall be of thee shall build the old waste places. This is what made this verse really stick out to me here in verse number 12, I believe it is. He says, they that shall be of thee shall build the old waste places. What is he talking about here? Those who serve God with sincere hearts and actions are going to accomplish things for God. Things that others may say impossible. Rebuilding things that others say cannot be rebuilt. And so this is why it struck me. Sometimes we begin to think in our minds that it's hopeless, it cannot be rebuilt, it cannot be restored, that it is going to be this way forever, and we have to remind ourselves, no, because it is not me that does the rebuilding, it is God that does the rebuilding, and therefore, I need to go back to the previous verses and make sure that I'm falling in line with God, what God is actually asking me to do there. You can't build anything for God's kingdom on the foundation of a superficial walk with God. Write that down. You can't build anything for the Lord with a superficial walk with God. Roots can't grow deep. They cannot get nutrients. They will not last the heat, and they will not last the wind, and therefore nothing will inevitably get built. Now, I'm going to end here, even though we haven't finished the chapter yet, but we'll come back and we'll finish these thoughts next week, but we haven't even got to the whole Sabbath part yet. But do you understand the main point of this passage? I think I've tried to very clearly point out the main point of chapter 58. It's not about the religious ritual. You say, I'm followed all the right steps, God, and God says, well, you might have followed most of the right steps, but you forgot to bring me along with you in this process. You forgot the relationship with me. You forgot to be right with me. And so we don't just throw out the fasting, and we don't just throw out the convictions, and we don't just throw that stuff out and say, I don't need all that stuff, I got God. No, we marry the two together. We be right before God and have that relationship with God. We use the fasting to get a hold of God. And then he hears, and then he does all these things, with the light breaking forth this morning, health springing forth speedily, righteousness going before thee, the glory of God, of the Lord being thy rear reward, calling out and God answering us and hearing us. I like this. And he says also, the Lord shall guide thee continually and satisfy thy soul in drought. Hey, have you guys ever experienced spiritual drought? Or maybe it's just a time period in your life where it just feels like a drought. Maybe not literally, but it just feels like everything's dried up and there's just no joy or life. It just feels like nothing's happening, like there's no fountains of blessing going on in this particular time. You just feel like you're in the midst of a drought from around you. And he says that he'd be like that spring of water whose waters fail not, satisfying thy soul with drought. Thou shalt be like a watered garden and like a spring of water whose waters fail not. I think verse 12 would be a good reminder for each one of us to kind of remember as a theme verse for this year. Hey, we want to build up those wasted places. The places that are broken down, the places that have wasted away. And of course, you can make application in a variety of ways concerning that, but how do we do that? By trying harder? By being more religious? No, not at all. By doing more rituals? No, not at all. It is by being right before God, getting a hold of God's heart. Let me encourage you in that way this evening. Think about that. We'll come back next week and finish up chapter 58 and get into chapter 59 next Wednesday evening.